The flight attendant stood firm, blocking his way. "Sir, please move to the economy class. First class is reserved for premium passengers." The man looked up, his gaze calm and unreadable. She had no idea who she was speaking to. And by the time she realized her mistake, it was too late. The airplane door remained open, and passengers were gradually finding their seats. Among the crowd, Ethan Vance lowered himself into his first-class seat, carefully placing his bag neatly under the seat in front of him. He subtly adjusted his seating position, feeling the smooth leather of the seat against his back. This was a rare experience for him, a luxury he had almost never allowed himself to enjoy. Ethan's life had always been about giving to his students, to the school, to the community. But this time he decided to grant himself a small privilege, a vacation he had delayed for far too long. Ethan glanced out the window, watching the bustling runway, unaware that this moment of calm was about to be disrupted. A shadow fell over his seat. "Sir, I need to check your ticket." Ethan turned, meeting the gaze of the flight attendant, Chandler. She was tall, confident in demeanor, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. But there was something more in those eyes: suspicion. Ethan nodded, without hesitation, pulling his ticket from his jacket pocket and handing it to her. Chandler glanced over the ticket, furrowing her brow. "This is a first-class ticket," her voice tinged with evident doubt. "That's correct," Ethan replied calmly. Chandler stared at him for a moment, then pursed her lips. "Are you sure, sir? Are you sure, sir? This ticket might have been mistakenly issued to you." A few passengers subtly turned their heads, sensing the shift in tone. Some looked away, pretending not to notice, while others quietly observed, their curiosity piqued. Ethan exhaled slowly. "There's no mistake. I purchased this ticket myself." Miss Chandler let out a sigh, her impatience momentarily showing. "All right, I'll need to verify some information in the system. Please step aside while I handle this." Ethan held her gaze for a moment before nodding. He unfastened his seatbelt, stood up, his demeanor calm yet resolute. Other first-class passengers avoided his gaze, pretending not to notice what was happening. Miss Chandler motioned for him to follow her towards the galley. She picked up the intercom phone, entered a code, and began speaking. Her voice lowered, but Ethan could still clearly hear the irritation in every word. After a few seconds, she turned back, wearing a smile that was a bit too forced, a smile anyone could tell was insincere. "There seems to be an issue with your booking," she said. "We can arrange a seat for you in economy class while we resolve this issue." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "There's no issue. My ticket is perfectly valid." Her smile faded. "Sir, I don't want to have to repeat myself. Please gather your belongings and move to the economy class." The atmosphere on the plane shifted noticeably. Some passengers in the economy class began to pay attention, looking up to see what was going on. A ripple of murmurs spread subtly throughout the cabin, like quiet waves gently weaving through the aisles. Ethan stared at Chandler for a long time. And in her gaze, he could clearly see, she had made up her mind that he did not belong here. It didn't matter what he said, it didn't matter what his ticket said, in her mind he had no right to be here. Without saying another word, he took a deep breath, his eyes cold, and turned to walk forward, deciding that he would not let this slide so easily. Ethan turned around, heading back to his seat, reaching up to the overhead compartment and pulling down his bag. He slung the strap over his shoulder and began walking down the aisle, heading toward economy class. He could feel the eyes following him, some filled with curiosity, others with a quiet judgment. But no one spoke. Not a single word was said. Ethan sat down in an empty seat in economy class, taking a deep breath. The space was tighter, the seat harder, but what disturbed him wasn't the downgrade. It was the humiliation. He hesitated for a moment, then swiped his phone screen, typing a message. "Boarded the plane. Got moved to economy. The flight attendant refused to check my ticket properly." He hit send. Only a few seconds later, his phone vibrated with a response. "What do you mean? They moved you?" Ethan glanced toward the front of the plane. Miss Chandler was still going about her duties, completely unaware that she had just made a serious mistake. The phone vibrated again. "Give me the flight number." Ethan tapped on the screen, sending it off. A pause followed. Then the final message appeared. "Stay put. This isn't over." Ethan leaned his head against the hard seat, his eyes glued to the phone screen. The hum of the airplane engines was loud, but his mind drifted elsewhere. He had spent his whole life teaching respect, fairness, and patience. Yet now he was being shoved aside without consideration, without hesitation, as if he were invisible. The first-class passengers, Those who had witnessed him being escorted out simply returned to their conversations, their drinks, their comfort. No one spoke up. No one asked if he needed help. The phone vibrated again. Who was the flight attendant? Ethan sighed, rubbing his temple before typing a reply. I didn't catch her name, just saw Chandler on the name tag. The reply came almost instantly. Noted. Ethan exhaled slowly. He didn't know what was happening on the other end, but he trusted the person. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Miss Chandler poured a cup of coffee quickly, ignoring the curious looks from the other attendants. One of them, a young woman named Sienna, hesitated before speaking up. Is there an issue with that man's ticket? Miss Chandler rolled her eyes, her tone laced with disdain. He was sitting in first class. Sienna furrowed her brow. But I've seen him already. Miss Chandler cut her off, taking a sip of coffee, her voice so firm it brooked no argument. He doesn't look like a first-class passenger. Probably a system error or someone gave him the wrong ticket. Either way, I'm not letting him sit up there when it's clear he doesn't belong. Sienna felt a tight knot in her stomach. She wanted to speak up, to challenge her, but she knew better. Miss Chandler had been with the airline for years, known for her strictness and refusal to admit when she was wrong. Sienna's gaze drifted to the first-class section, where Ethan's empty seat stood out among the luxurious chairs. Something didn't feel right here. In economy class, Ethan's phone vibrated with a new message. What gate will the plane land at? Ethan raised an eyebrow, pulling the boarding pass from the seat pocket in front of him and typing in the gate number. A pause followed. Then the final message appeared. Understood. Stay put. Ethan leaned back in his seat, watching the flight attendants move around the cabin, pouring drinks, adjusting tray tables, acting as though nothing had happened. But his gut told him that this wasn't over. This isn't over. It's not even begun. Miss Chandler continued to move through first class, adjusting food trays, refilling drinks, completely unconcerned with what had just happened. She had encountered numerous passengers trying to sneak into first class during her years of service, and to her, this was just another routine incident. The man had left without protesting, which only reinforced her belief. He didn't belong here. But what she didn't realize was that her decision had triggered a chain of events she could never have foreseen. In the cockpit, Captain Rowan Hughes received an urgent message on the internal communication system. When he saw the name in the verification request, his eyes immediately sharpened. He turned to the co-pilot, his voice low and serious. Pull up the passenger list. The co-pilot frowned but complied, his fingers quickly scrolling across the screen until the list appeared. The names flicked by until it stopped at one specific name, Ethan Vance. Captain Hughes read the information twice, his heartbeat quickening. He knew that name. Not just him, everyone in the aviation industry knew that name. His gaze returned to the message on the screen. The request was crystal clear. Immediate confirmation. Was Ethan Vance moved out of first class? The co-pilot glanced over, sensing the tension in the air. Is that Ethan Vance? Captain Hughes didn't respond immediately. In his mind, a series of potential consequences from the recent decision were rapidly falling into place. He grabbed the intercom phone and dialed the head flight attendant. A few seconds later, Miss Chandler's voice came through, calm and casual. Chandler speaking. Captain Hughes' voice remained composed, but there was a weight in his words this time. Miss Chandler, I need to confirm something. Did you request for a first-class passenger named Ethan Vance to leave his seat? On the other end, there was a brief silence, then Miss Chandler's confident voice returned. Yes, Captain. His ticket didn't qualify for first class, so I asked him to move to economy. Captain Hughes tightened his grip on the phone. Did you check his ticket? Miss Chandler let out a small laugh. A laugh from someone who thought they were being questioned unfairly. Captain, I've been in this industry for over a decade. I can tell who belongs in first class and who doesn't. This time, the silence stretched on longer. When Captain Hughes spoke again, his voice was colder, sharper. Miss Chandler, do you know who Ethan Vance is? There was complete silence on the other end of the line. But Captain Hughes didn't wait for an answer. Ethan Vance is the owner of this airline. The line suddenly dropped into a chilling void. Miss Chandler's face went pale. For the first time since the flight began, she felt a sensation she had never experienced before. Panic. Her fingers tightened around the intercom phone, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made a mistake that couldn't be undone. The silence between her and Captain Hughes grew dense, suffocating. She tried to process what she had just heard, but her mind went blank. Ethan Vance. The owner of the airline. No, it couldn't be. He didn't look like someone who owned an airline. He wasn't wearing a suit. He didn't act like a person of power. He just sat there quietly, not showing any sense of entitlement or arrogance. Miss Chandler swallowed hard, trying to speak. There must be some kind of mix-up. But this time her voice lacked the usual confidence. "There's no mix-up," Captain Hughes responded, his tone firm and unwavering. "Mr. Vance is a verified first-class passenger. You asked him to leave without even checking his ticket. And now we've just received direct instructions from the operations office." Miss Chandler felt the blood drain from her body. "Instructions?" she stammered. Captain Hughes continued, each word slicing through her panic. "You are to personally escort Mr. Vance back to first class and offer a public apology. Upon landing, you will report to the operations board for a formal review of this incident." Miss Chandler gasped for breath. A formal review. This wasn't just a regular complaint. This was a serious incident, one that could change her entire career. She struggled to keep her voice steady. "Captain, I was just following protocol." A brief silence followed. Then Captain Hughes' voice came through, cold and resolute. "No, Miss Chandler. You didn't follow protocol." The call ended. Miss Chandler slowly lowered the phone, her hands trembling slightly. Around her, the other flight attendants began to notice the change in her expression. Sienna, the younger flight attendant, cautiously spoke up. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" Miss Chandler didn't answer. Her mind was spinning. She had always believed she was in control in situations like this. She had served on hundreds of flights, made countless decisions, and had never once been challenged. But this time she no longer had control. She was about to return to economy class. But not as the one giving orders. Each step toward the economy section made this realization even clearer. She had insulted the most powerful man on the plane. She had forced him out of his first-class seat, spoken sharply to him, without knowing that he was the owner of the airline. And now she had to face the consequences. The atmosphere in economy seemed quieter than before. Some passengers had started to notice that something was amiss. Their eyes flicked between Miss Chandler and Ethan, who was still sitting there, completely calm. His posture was relaxed, his expression devoid of any obvious emotion. He wasn't angry. He wasn't complaining. And that made everything worse. Miss Chandler stopped beside his row, clearing her throat and trying to maintain her professional demeanor. "Mr. Vance," her voice lacked the authority it had held before, "there's been a misunderstanding. I would like to escort you back to your seat in first class." Ethan slowly lifted his head, his gaze locking onto hers. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his tone calm. Miss Chandler tightened her grip on her hands. For the first time in years she found it difficult to speak. "Yes," she quickly replied. I apologize for the confusion. Please allow me to take you back to your seat." Several passengers nearby stopped pretending not to hear. They had witnessed the entire exchange earlier, and now they were witnessing something new. A flight attendant, once full of authority, being forced to step back. Ethan didn't move. He simply tilted his head slightly, his voice still calm but firm. "Why?" Miss Chandler blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Excuse me?" Ethan leaned forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "Why now do you want to take me back to my seat? Earlier, you were very sure that I didn't belong there." A few passengers exchanged quiet glances. They could feel the shift in power. Miss Chandler felt her throat dry. There was an issue with the seating arrangement. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, letting the silence linger. Miss Chandler shifted her stance, feeling her confidence being eroded under his gaze. Then, without raising his voice, without showing anger, Ethan made her feel something she wasn't familiar with. Responsibility. "I had my ticket," he said. "You saw it." Miss Chandler nodded stiffly. "Yet you still asked me to leave." Ethan continued, his tone unchanged. "You didn't check the system. You didn't ask anyone else in first class for their tickets. Just me." The atmosphere in the cabin seemed to grow heavier. Miss Chandler opened her mouth to say something, but for the first time in her life she had no defense. Ethan leaned back, his expression unreadable. "If you're going to apologize," he said, his voice calm, "at least tell the truth." A suffocating silence enveloped the cabin. Miss Chandler could feel every eye on her. She was used to making decisions, giving orders, controlling situations. But this time she had been wrong. And everyone around her knew it. She took a deep breath, the weight of her mistake pressing down on her chest. She knew there was only one way to escape this moment. She had to do something she had never had to do before. Admit she was wrong. She stood up straight, meeting his eyes. "You're right," she said, her voice softer, no longer with the authority it once held. "I didn't check the system. I made an assumption. And I treated you unfairly." She had never faced anything like this. Miss Chandler's fingers clenched tightly around the counter, her mind replaying the events of the last few minutes over and over. She had been forced to walk through economy, exactly the same aisle she had asked Ethan to move down earlier. And every passenger had witnessed it. The murmurs, the eyes following her, the shift in the atmosphere. Clearly they weren't just watching a flight attendant doing her job. They were watching her correct her mistake. And worse, they were watching her fail. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Are you really this stressed about it?" Miss Chandler spun around. Sienna was standing at the galley entrance, arms crossed, her eyes probing. "I don't need your opinion right now," Miss Chandler snapped. But her tone wasn't as sharp as before. Sienna smirked, tilting her head slightly. "I'm just saying, you don't look as confident as you did 20 minutes ago." Miss Chandler clenched her jaw. She had no intention of continuing this conversation. She had worked hard to get to the position she held today. She had climbed every rung of her career, making decisions based on efficiency, order, and professionalism. She had been certain she was doing the right thing. Yet now, she clung to the counter as though it were the only thing keeping her steady, while the world around her seemed to be spinning. Sienna sighed, shaking her head. "You know, if you had just treated him like any other first-class passenger from the start, none of this would have happened." Miss Chandler glared at her. "I didn't do anything wrong." Sienna raised an eyebrow, her tone laced with implication. "Really? Because from what I saw, you didn't check his ticket. You embarrassed him in front of everyone. And now you have to take him back to his seat. Like a child being sent back to class after being kicked out." Miss Chandler felt her face flush. Because she knew Sienna was right. Everyone on this flight knew it too. Miss Chandler felt her heart race. "It's not what you think." "Cut it out." Sienna interrupted, her tone colder. "Because we both know what's going to happen when we land." A chill ran down Miss Chandler's spine. She hadn't dared think that far ahead. What awaited her when the plane touched down? A passenger complaint? A meeting with her superiors? A warning? Or something worse? Was this the end of her career? Miss Chandler immediately pushed that thought aside. She wouldn't let one passenger ruin everything she had worked for over the years. But deep down, she knew that this was no longer within her control. In first class, Ethan Vance sat comfortably in his seat. But he wasn't relaxed. His mind was racing. He was thinking about the bigger picture, about the true meaning of what had just happened. Ethan had worked in the aviation industry for many years. He had seen how this system operated from top to bottom. And it wasn't just one flight attendant making a mistake. It was evidence of an entire system, where so many people like Miss Chandler had done the same to others without facing any consequences. Ethan picked up his phone, scrolling through the messages. There was a new one waiting. "The assistant is finalizing the details. Official feedback will be provided after landing." Ethan smirked slightly. He had predicted what was about to happen. This wouldn't be just a gentle reminder. No. Miss Chandler wouldn't just be called in for a chat. She was about to become a lesson. Ethan set the phone down and looked around first class. The passengers who had witnessed him being kicked out earlier, now they were avoiding his gaze. It was almost funny. People only cared when they realized that the person sitting next to them could be them. A person with power. But what about those times when this happens to people without power? The ones who never get an apology. Who never have their seat returned. Who never get the chance to see the person who humiliated them burdened by their own mistake. Ethan clenched his jaw. Maybe it was time to change that. He leaned back, stretching his legs comfortably. The plane was still in the air. But the consequences of this had already begun the moment this happened. The plane kept its steady course through the sky. But for Miss Chandler, time seemed to stretch endlessly. Every second felt like a nightmare. She stood in the galley, gripping the counter, feeling as if the solid ground beneath her had turned into shifting sand. And she was sinking. With every passing minute, she sank a little deeper. On the other hand, for Ethan Vance, everything was moving quickly. The pieces were falling into place. Decisions were being made behind the scenes. And for the remaining passengers, they felt a distinct change. Even those who hadn't cared from the beginning of the flight now realized that something very big was happening. It was just, no one knew how big it truly was. The fear within Miss Chandler grew stronger. She took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. The rules, the order, the sense of control she had always relied on. Now, all of it had turned against her in just a few short minutes. She had miscalculated. For years she believed her instincts were always right. She believed she had the right to decide who belonged where. But now, for the first time in her career, she was the one being judged. Judged. And worse, she was waiting for a punishment that she couldn't control. Sienna remained leaning against the galley door, finally speaking up again. Her voice was calm, but there was something else beneath it. You should sit down before you pass out. Miss Chandler glared at her, but there was no fire left in her eyes. Instead, she straightened her back, tightened her shoulders, forcing herself to get back into work mode. She grabbed the tray, adjusted the glasses. I still have work to do, she muttered. Sienna stared at her for a long moment before she smirked slightly. That's all you've got now. Miss Chandler pretended she hadn't heard that. She had dealt with difficult passengers before. She had handled rude executives, arrogant businessmen demanding passengers. She had made decisions, moved passengers, maintained order. But this time, this wasn't just about a seat, but it was about who she had misjudged, and who she had humiliated in front of the entire plane. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed the glass back onto the tray. The truth tightened around her like claws. She had just smeared the one person on the flight with enough power to end her career. With a single email. And worst of all, she had done it in front of everyone. She glanced toward the cockpit, wondering if she should go in there. Try to explain. Try to make an excuse. Before the plane landed. But deep down she knew. No explanation could fix this. Ethan's next move. In first class, Ethan Vance continued scrolling through his emails. His expression was calm but focused. His assistant had sent a preliminary report. And as expected, the incident had been escalated to higher levels. He knew this airline inside and out. And he knew exactly how to handle situations like this. Miss Chandler wouldn't simply be switched to another flight. No, this wouldn't be overlooked. This matter would be reviewed at the highest levels. And not just for her, but for the entire crew. This wasn't just one mistake. But how many times this had happened before without any consequences? Ethan looked up for a moment, catching the confused gazes of other passengers. Some had witnessed everything. Some had chosen to ignore it. But now they didn't know what to do. Because they knew who he was. Ethan slowly exhaled, stretched his fingers lightly, then typed a quick message. Ethan. We'll be landing in less than an hour. Make sure the ground team is ready. The response came immediately. Assistant. They'll be waiting at the gate. Ethan's expression remained unchanged. He was never the type to yell. Never needed to flaunt power unnecessarily. But sometimes, a silent lesson could weigh more than any shouting. And this would be one of those times. The crew realizes what's happening. In the galley, the other flight attendants were whispering to each other. Even those who had been neutral at first were starting to feel the consequences approaching. Jacob, a flight attendant, nudged Sienna gently. What's going on? Sienna crossed her arms and shrugged. Chandler's really messed up this time. Jacob grimaced. You mean the whole seat-switching thing with that guy? That guy, Sienna cut in, is Ethan Vance. Jacob froze. His eyes widened slightly, the name weighing more heavily in his mind. No way, he mumbled. She kicked him out of first class? Sienna gave a slight smirk, but there was no humor in it. Yeah. Jacob rubbed the back of his neck. Shit. She's done for, right? Sienna sighed slowly. If she's lucky, she'll just get fired. Jacob raised an eyebrow. Just. Sienna glanced toward the first-class cabin where Ethan was still sitting. Unruffled. Completely in control of the situation. She shook her head. We work in aviation, Jacob. Do you really think nothing's going to happen when she insults the man who holds power over the sky she's flying through? Jacob whistled softly, his gaze shifting toward Miss Chandler. She was still standing in the galley, pretending to be busy. But now everyone could see the truth. She was sweating. Begin descent. A few minutes later, the seatbelt sign chimed on. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Please fasten your seatbelts and ensure your tray tables are stowed. We will be landing shortly. Ethan calmly fastened his seatbelt, his expression unchanged. But he checked his phone one last time. A new message had arrived. Assistant. Security has been notified. Senior leadership will be waiting at the gate. Miss Chandler is required to report immediately after landing. Ethan allowed a faint smirk, gently slipping his phone back into his pocket. He wasn't the type to enjoy others' suffering. But he believed in accountability. And Miss Chandler. She had no idea what was coming her way. The plane began its descent. But for Miss Chandler, the real fall had only just begun. Miss Chandler realizes everything. She stood near the galley, her arms tightly crossed. Her eyes were fixed on the seatbelt sign above. Around her, the soft clicks of passengers fastening their seatbelts, the rustling of luggage being stowed away, the familiar sounds of a flight nearing its end. But for her, this flight would not end like the others. She had once thought she understood power. That a firm voice, a straight posture, a confident gaze, that was power. But now she realized, true power doesn't need to speak. It doesn't need to argue. It only needs to wait. And right now, Ethan Vance was waiting. The final moments in the air. Ethan sat comfortably, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. The final moments before landing. Ethan rested his hand on the armrest, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm as the plane continued to descend. He didn't want to humiliate Miss Chandler just for the sake of satisfaction. He wasn't cruel. But this wasn't just about him. He had worked in the aviation industry long enough to know that things like this happen more often than people realized. Passengers being judged. Passengers being looked down upon. And most of the time, they never got justice. But this time was different. He could feel the shift in the air. Not just from the decreasing altitude, but from the way the entire crew was behaving. The flight attendants who once moved confidently through the first-class cabin now glanced furtively at Miss Chandler. Some had quietly distanced themselves from her, as if they could already smell the inevitable outcome. Sienna stood near the aisle, exchanging a quick glance with Jacob. No words were spoken. But they didn't need to be. They knew. And Miss Chandler, she knew it too. Preparing for landing, the end is near. The captain's voice came through the speakers again, as smooth as ever. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Miss Chandler clenched her hands into fists. She forced herself to stand straight, trying to steady her breathing, pretending everything was normal. But nothing was normal. Because in less than 10 minutes she would step off this plane. No longer a seasoned flight attendant, but a woman walking straight into a storm. She had to think. What could she do? Would an apology be enough? Could she explain herself? No. She had already apologized. And Ethan had made his decision. This wasn't just about whether she could keep her job. It was about something much bigger. Landing, the moment everything changes. The plane's wheels hit the runway with a jolt, sending a slight tremor through the cabin. The engines roared for a moment before gradually stabilizing, guiding the plane slowly toward the gate. Passengers exhaled. Some stretched. Some reached for their luggage. Most were completely unaware that a storm was quietly brewing behind them. But Miss Chandler, she felt it. She wanted to grab the intercom, to ask the captain if she needed to report anywhere after landing. But she already knew the answer. Everything was out of her control now. She took one last deep breath, adjusted her uniform, trying to hold onto the last shred of power she had left. But when she looked up, she met Sienna's gaze. The younger flight attendant said nothing. She just looked. And that was so much worse. The final announcement. The intercom crackled softly, and the captain's voice came through once more. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us today. Ethan remained still. He could feel the tension radiating from the galley, from the flight attendants, from the handful of passengers who had pieced things together. He wasn't angry. He wasn't gloating. He was simply waiting. Because the hardest part of this flight hadn't even begun yet. And Miss Chandler, she still didn't know just how bad it would get. Because as soon as the plane rolled up to the gate, two men in dark uniforms were already waiting. They are waiting. Just beyond the glass, two security officers stood sternly. Behind them, a senior executive of the airline, arms crossed, face unreadable. They were waiting for her. Ding. The seatbelt sign turned off. Passengers stood up, stretching, reaching for their luggage. The familiar hustle of a flight just landed. But for Miss Chandler, nothing was familiar. This wasn't just the end of a flight. It was the end of something much bigger. And she could feel it. Frozen. The lights had just turned off. But she couldn't move. Sitting motionless in the galley, her fingers gripping the counter, Miss Chandler stared at the cabin door. First-class passengers casually stood up, stretched, grabbed their bags, acting as if this were just another routine flight. But for her it wasn't. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the cabin door, where security and the senior executive stood waiting. They weren't here for a minor in-flight disturbance. Not for an airport issue. They were here for her. Her stomach tightened. She had always been the one in control. The one who set the rules. The one who enforced discipline. But now, She was the one being summoned. Ethan was still waiting. She glanced toward the first-class seats. Ethan still hadn't stood up. While other passengers busied themselves with their luggage, making casual conversation, he remained calm, composed, waiting. And she knew why. Because Ethan Vance had no reason to rush. He knew exactly what was about to happen. The walk of shame. Miss Chandler took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand tall. She adjusted her uniform, took a step forward. She had always believed that professionalism could resolve everything. But today, there was no way out of this. The final walk. Professionalism. But now, she wasn't sure if that even mattered anymore. Miss Chandler inhaled deeply and stepped into the aisle. And immediately, she felt the shift. The passengers who had once ignored her now stole glances as she passed by. Some had witnessed everything and were piecing the events together. Others simply sensed the tension thick in the air. She walked past the economy cabin. The place where she had forced Ethan to sit just hours ago. Now, she was the one being forced into something. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. Ethan stands. Just as Miss Chandler neared the cabin door, Ethan finally rose from his seat. He stretched, slow, unbothered, as if he had all the time in the world. With the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the flight, Ethan stepped into the aisle. Nearby passengers unconsciously tensed, as if only now realizing just how much had changed since the plane had taken off. The truth revealed. Miss Chandler reached the front door. Just a few steps away from facing the airline executive and security. Her heartbeat pounded in her throat. But they didn't speak immediately. They were waiting. Waiting for Ethan to step off first. And that was the moment Miss Chandler truly understood. This was never about removing a passenger from first class. It was about removing the wrong one. She heard Ethan's footsteps behind her. A presence of authority that required no effort. And for the first time since she had forced him out, Ethan finally spoke. His voice was low, deliberate, just enough for her to hear. Next time, check properly. The final reminder. Next time, check the ticket before you judge the person. No mockery. No cruelty. Just the truth. A truth she should have known long ago. Ethan stepped past her, just as composed as when he had arrived. Outside, the airline executive was waiting. A handshake. A nod of respect. Something she would never receive again. Miss Chandler could only stand in silence, feeling as if her entire career was crumbling around her. Consequences. Miss Chandler. The airline executive's voice rang out. Formal. Brief. But as heavy as a sentence. Come with us. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. Because what was left to say? For the first time in her life she understood. She was no longer in control. And she never would be again. The walk of defeat. Miss Chandler stepped onto the jet bridge. Each step heavier than the last. The noisy hum of the airport. Announcements over the speakers. The rolling wheels of suitcases. The hurried footsteps of travelers. It all sounded distant. She had walked these halls hundreds of times before. She had always walked with authority. Always with purpose. Always with confidence. But now, she was no longer walking as a leader. She was walking as the condemned. The airline executive strode ahead. A sharp gray suit, a face as cold as stone. Not sparing her a single glance. Security followed behind. Silent but unmistakably present. A quiet reminder. This was not a choice. She swallowed the tight knot in her throat, kept her back straight, clinging to the last shred of dignity she had left. Trying to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to make this right. A different path. Just beside her, Ethan Vance stepped off the plane. Through an entirely different exit. A different world. Outside. A sleek black car with tinted windows waited at the VIP entrance. Lucas Hayes, Ethan's assistant, stood beside it, a tablet in one hand, a phone in the other. He barely looked up as Ethan approached, effortlessly multitasking between emails and messages. The board knows. Lucas reported smoothly. They want to handle it internally before anything leaks. Ethan leaned back into the seat, casually adjusting his watch. And Chandler? His voice remained calm but firm. This time Lucas looked up, raising an eyebrow slightly. She's being escorted to a private meeting room as we speak. Ethan let out a quiet smile. I hope she enjoys her final meeting with the airline. No mercy. Lucas hesitated. Are you sure? The highest penalty? A suspension might be enough. Ethan glanced at Lucas. His usual calm gaze, but sharper this time. Lucas sighed. He already knew the answer. This isn't just about her. Ethan's voice was cold, deliberate. This is about all the ones like her. The ones who have been doing this for years and never got caught. Lucas nodded. He had seen this before. Ethan didn't care about personal revenge. He cared about change. And Miss Chandler had just become the perfect example. The final judgment. Miss Chandler walked into a silent hallway. No more murmuring passengers. No more colleagues watching. Just the cold, indifferent walls of the airport, and her final destination. The door opened. A sealed, soundproof meeting room with a single long table. Documents neatly arranged. One chair pulled out, waiting for her. Miss Chandler hesitated at the doorway, her chest tightening. She already knew how this would end. No way out. Inside the quiet room, only 3 senior airline executives sat. Not supervisors. Not managers. But the ones who decided who stayed. And who left. The ones who would determine her future. Miss Chandler swallowed hard, then stepped inside. The door behind her clicked shut. A small sound, yet deafening in her mind. A gray-haired woman, expression unreadable, folded her hands on the table in front of her. Miss Chandler, the woman's voice was calm yet absolute. Please have a seat. A trial without mercy. Miss Chandler slowly lowered herself into the chair, back straight, hands clenched tightly in her lap.no1 spoke. Then the gray-haired executive broke the silence once more. Do you understand why you're here? Miss Chandler's throat was dry. She knew that whatever she said next would determine the fate of her career. She licked her lips, forcing her voice to remain steady. There was a seating issue on the flight. A misunderstanding? The tall man with sharp eyes raised an eyebrow. A seating issue? Miss Chandler forced herself not to flinch. Yes, a misunderstanding regarding a passenger's placement in first class. A misunderstanding? He repeated, his voice cold. You're really calling it a misunderstanding? The room fell into absolute silence. And in that moment, Miss Chandler realized. They weren't here to listen to her defense. They already had all the evidence. The reports had been filed. The statements had been collected. Every action she had taken, laid bare before them. The final verdict. They had reviewed everything. And now they were here for one reason only. To pass judgment. There was no escaping this. The gray-haired woman slid a document toward Miss Chandler. Her voice was calm, like a judge delivering a sentence. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your position as head flight attendant. Miss Chandler felt her stomach plummet. Your employment with this airline is terminated. No way back. Her breath hitched, fingers tightening around the edge of the table. The second man raised a hand, cutting her off. This decision is final. Your conduct on Flight 417 was unacceptable. You failed to check a first-class passenger's ticket. You acted on bias. And you publicly humiliated someone who had every right to be there. The third man, his gaze sharp and unyielding, leaned forward. And Miss Chandler, he said, his voice low and cold, the man you humiliated was Ethan Vance. Collapse. The weight of that name crushed whatever last hope she had. She had spent her career passing judgment. She was used to deciding who belonged where. But now she was the one being judged. And she had been deemed unworthy. The end of an era. Miss Chandler stared at the termination letter. Her eyes burned. 10 years. 10 years in the air. 10 years of experience. Gone, because of one mistake. Just one. Just one misjudgment. She struggled to think of a way out. Something to say. Some way to salvage everything. But there was nothing. No second chances. No negotiations. Only consequences. Cold, unforgiving, undeniable. The gray-haired woman rose from her seat. The meeting was over. The true end. Security will escort you out. And just like that, it was over. Miss Chandler slowly stood, her hands trembling as she picked up the termination letter. As she turned to leave, the third executive spoke one last time. Maybe next time, he said, his voice even yet pointed. Before judging someone by their appearance, you'll think twice. Miss Chandler didn't respond. She walked to the door, her vision blurring, her body heavier than it had ever felt before. The security officer opened the door, and as she stepped into the hallway, reality crashed down. Cold, merciless, absolute. She had entered that room as a head flight attendant. And now she was just another nameless figure leaving the airport, with nowhere to go. Losing everything. Miss Chandler clenched the termination letter in her hands. Such a small piece of paper, yet it weighed so much. As if it carried every mistake she had made on that flight. The security officer walked just behind her, but they didn't need to escort her. She didn't resist. What was left to fight for? No longer herself. The long, stark white corridors of the management office made everything feel surreal. Just hours ago she had been the one in charge. The one who stood firm. The one who controlled every situation with authority. Now she was the one being escorted out. Out of the very company she had dedicated a decade of her life to. Each step felt like sinking into quicksand. It wasn't just about losing a job. It was about losing herself. Her career vanished in mere seconds. She had believed she was good at this job. She had believed she was strict but fair. But that belief had been wrong from the very start. A mistake that cannot be erased. Yes, but in her mind it had always been part of the job. Maintaining order. Controlling passengers. Making quick judgments. She had never doubted herself. Until today. Because now, for the first time in her life, she was forced to confront the way she had behaved. And what she saw was not pretty. The moment kept replaying in her mind. The moment she questioned Ethan Vance without even checking his ticket. The confidence in her voice as she dismissed him. The quiet satisfaction she felt as she sent him to economy. She had been so certain she was right. And that certainty had destroyed her. The price to pay. The security officers led her through a side exit, far from crowded areas. No public dismissal. No grand spectacle. Just silent, ruthless consequences. But that made it worse. Because this was the kind of punishment that wouldn't fade with time. This was the kind of punishment that would follow her for the rest of her life. The beginning, or an end. The emergency exit door swung open and she stepped outside. For the first time in 10 years, no longer in uniform. No title. No status. She was no longer part of this world. Just a former employee, walking toward an uncertain future. A part of her wanted to scream. To argue. To defend herself. But what was left to defend? The entire airline knew what had happened. Her name had likely spread across the aviation industry. A cautionary tale for anyone who judged the wrong person. Could she ever be hired by another airline? She doubted it. Because her reputation had completely collapsed. She had spent her entire career passing judgment. And now, she was the one being judged. The judgment of the industry. The aviation industry had made its decision about her, swiftly. No different from how she had judged countless passengers before. Off in the distance, near a private exit, a sleek luxury car sat waiting. Inside, Ethan Vance watched in silence. Miss Chandler stepped out, standing motionless in the open space. As if she didn't know where to go. She hadn't seen him yet. Lucas, Ethan's assistant, checked his phone, then glanced up. She's out. Ethan didn't respond right away. He simply watched, his expression unreadable. Lucas studied Chandler for a moment before murmuring, "She looks lost." Ethan exhaled softly, his gaze never leaving her. "She should." Was a lesson learned? Lucas hesitated, then asked, "Do you think she'll learn anything from this?" Ethan leaned back against the seat, eyes on the car's ceiling. "I don't know. Some people do. Some don't." Lucas nodded, then asked again, "Do you think she deserved to be fired?" Ethan thought for a moment. He wasn't a man who sought revenge. He didn't take pleasure in watching someone lose everything. But this was never about revenge. It was about accountability. Finally he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "I think she deserved to know what it feels like to be dismissed without a second thought. To be treated as an inconvenience. To be made to feel like she didn't belong. Because that's exactly what she did to me." Lucas didn't argue. Because they both knew, this was never just about one flight attendant. This was about how those in power abused it. And today, for the first time, the consequences had fallen on the right person. The final cry for help. Miss Chandler finally moved. She pulled out her phone, fingers trembling. She scrolled through her contacts. She needed to call someone. A friend. A former colleague. Someone who could help. But who was left? The door closes. She needed a way back into the airline industry. Because without it, she had nothing. Her entire life had revolved around this job. And now, she had nothing at all. She opened her contacts and dialed an old manager. 1 ring, 2, 3. Voicemail. She swallowed hard and tried another number. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. A cold, sharp weight settled in her stomach. They all knew. And no one would help her. No one wanted to be associated with her name now. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had spent years deciding the fate of others. And now the airline industry had decided hers. The price paid. She lowered her phone, her gaze empty. Her body felt numb. Because for the first time since this all began, since the moment she ordered Ethan Vance out of first class, without even checking his ticket, she finally understood. She saw herself through the eyes of others. Not as a leader, not as a professional, but as someone who had let power blind her. And now, she had no power left. She had judged the wrong man. And the price she paid was everything. The final words. Ethan still watched her from inside the car. His face unreadable. Lucas sat silently beside him. Ethan finally spoke, though to no one in particular. Maybe next time she'll think twice. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly as the car pulled away. Because this time the lesson wasn't his to learn. It was hers. Miss Chandler stood there, motionless, outside the airport's private exit. The last call. She still clutched her phone, though the screen had gone dark. She had called everyone who might help her. Not a single one had answered. A cold, twisting knot tightened in her stomach. The airline industry had turned its back on her. Before she even had the chance to plead her case. She had always thought she was untouchable. Had flight attendants didn't get fired. They got reassigned. Given second chances. But this time, there was no quiet meeting. No slap on the wrist. Because this wasn't just about a misplaced seat. This was public humiliation. A judgment made on bias. Not truth. And she had made it against the wrong person. A person who could make sure she never stepped foot in this industry again. Panic. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps. Panic creeping into every fiber of her being. She had spent 10 years building this career. The late-night shifts, the exhausting long-haul flights, the difficult passengers. She had endured it all. She had earned her place. Or at least, she had thought so. But in the end, less than a minute was all it took to erase everything. The cost of one wrong decision. She watched as the sleek black car disappeared from the airport. Ethan was gone. He had stepped off that plane with his dignity intact. His power untouched. His career still in place. And her. She had nothing. The worst part was, he hadn't done this for revenge. He hadn't yelled at her. Hadn't demanded her termination. Hadn't even shown anger. He had simply let her bury herself. The moment she removed him from his seat without checking his ticket, it was already over. Fate was sealed. The moment she didn't bother to check the ticket, the moment she decided he didn't belong in first class, based solely on a baseless assumption, she had sealed her own fate. Now, she had to face a bitter truth. How many times had she done this before? How many others had been treated the same way? How many passengers had been sent to economy? Into discomfort, into humiliation? With no way to fight back? The only difference between them and Ethan Vance? They didn't own the airline. They could only endure in silence. And now, she was the one forced to endure. No way out. A cold breeze swept past. But she didn't feel it anymore. Her mind was spinning. What now? She couldn't walk back into the airport like nothing had happened. She couldn't apply to another airline and hope they hadn't heard. Because they had. The aviation industry was small. News traveled fast. Even if this never made the headlines, the people who mattered already knew. Every application would be rejected. Every reference letter ignored. Her name was tainted. And the worst part? She had no backup plan. A new reality. She had dedicated her entire life to this job. She had never once considered, what would she do if it was taken away? And now, she had to figure it out. Alone. 2 airport staff walked past, chatting and laughing. They headed toward the employee entrance. A door she had walked through countless times. But today, that door was closed. Fate has arrived. The world she once controlled no longer belonged to her. Her power was gone. Her status was gone. Her certainty was gone. She wanted to convince herself that this was unfair, that she deserved another chance. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had built her career on judgment. And today she was the one being judged. She turned away, walking out of the airport. Not because she wanted to leave, but because she had nowhere else to go. For the first time in her life, she was the one left behind. Heavy steps. Steps she took felt heavier than the last. The polished floors of the terminal, now left behind. In front of her, only a rough, uneven asphalt road, leading toward the distant parking lot. The world she once commanded, the flights, the crew, the passengers, no longer belonged to her. For the first time in 10 years, she had nowhere left to go. The true end. She had once considered the airport her second home. She knew every hidden corner. From the break room where she sipped coffee in the early mornings, to the service desk where she watched lost passengers struggle with their paperwork. She had memorized airline codes. She had rehearsed emergency protocols until they became instinct. She had believed she knew how to handle passengers best. But now, none of it mattered. She had once walked these halls with authority in her hands. But today, she was just someone walking away, empty-handed, stripped of everything, left behind. No longer anyone at all. The security guard near the employee exit watched as she passed by. He had seen her countless times before, rushing to flights, giving orders, demanding efficiency. But now she was just another face in the crowd. A former employee. A mistake leaving the airport. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Her chest tightened as she stepped through the automatic doors, into the stifling heat of the late afternoon. For a fleeting moment of desperation, she almost turned back, almost stepped inside once more, almost tried to explain one last time. But there was no one left to listen. The final, futile attempt to regain control. She pulled her phone from her pocket, fingers trembling. The contact list blurred before her eyes as she scrolled through the names. Her mind clung desperately to the hope that someone, anyone, could help. Maybe she could talk to an old supervisor. Maybe she could find a way to be reinstated. Maybe she could fix this. But as she dialed each number, a painful truth set in. No one answered. Voicemail after voicemail. Unread messages. Complete silence. She clenched the phone tightly in her hand. She had spent years enforcing order, making decisions, controlling the fate of others. And now, she had no control at all. Her entire career she had decided who belonged and who didn't. But now, the one who didn't, she took a deep breath, blinking rapidly, forcing herself to keep walking. She wouldn't break. She refused to break. She had been a flight attendant for 10 years. She had seen grown men cry over missed flights. Families unravel over lost luggage. Passengers, furious, turn helpless when their demands were denied. But this time, the one left with nothing was her. She had witnessed countless people lose their composure, their patience, even their dignity. But now, it was her turn to experience the very reality she had once imposed on others. And the feeling was anything but easy to bear. Ethan's final decision. Not far away, Ethan Vance sat in the backseat of the car, silently watching the airport shrink in the distance. Lucas sat beside him, laptop open, his eyes scanning the final report from the airline's executive board. Belong was her. The termination is now officially in effect. Lucas spoke after a brief silence, his fingers tapping lightly on the keyboard. They marked it as a policy violation but won't be making any public statements. Ethan gave a slight nod, his fingers drumming idly against the seat. He wasn't surprised. Corporations rarely admitted mistakes. They would handle everything quietly. Miss Chandler's name would be erased from the employee database. Her records wiped from the system. And the entire incident would be buried. But this time, the consequences were real. Ethan turned to Lucas. Any sign she's trying to appeal? Lucas shook his head. She's been calling a lot of people, but no one's answering. Her connections are already distancing themselves. Ethan wasn't surprised. In this world, reputation was everything. And Miss Chandler's name was ruined. Lucas hesitated, glancing at his boss. Do you ever feel guilty about things like this? Ethan didn't answer right away. He quietly watched the sunset disappear beyond the horizon. Finally, his voice was thoughtful, measured. I don't like seeing people lose their jobs. Lucas raised an eyebrow but noticed the slight clench in Ethan's jaw. But I also don't like watching people get away with treating others like garbage. Lucas nodded slowly. Ethan continued. How many passengers have been treated the way she treated me, with no one stepping in? Lucas didn't need to respond. They both knew the truth. Ethan had been lucky. He had power. He had a voice. But what about the countless others? Those who were thrown out of first class, dismissed, unfairly judged. They had no voice. No one stood up for them. And that was why this mattered. This wasn't just about Miss Chandler losing her job. This was a message. A warning that, if you think you can treat people unfairly and walk away without consequences, think again. Ethan leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. Lucas watched him. So it's over? Ethan gave a small nod. It's over. Miss Chandler's final realization. Miss Chandler reached the far end of the parking lot. Her feet ached. Her mind swirled. She stopped beside the bus stop, her vacant eyes staring at the empty road ahead. For the first time since stepping onto that plane, she was forced to face herself. No uniform. No title. No power. No more excuses. She had been fired. Abandoned by colleagues. Lost everything. And for the first time, she had no one to blame but herself. The airline hadn't done this to her. Ethan Vance hadn't done this to her. It had done this to herself. She sank onto the cold metal bench, her hands gripping the edge tightly. Her thoughts spiraled. She had once believed that power. She had once believed that power meant never being questioned. But now, she finally understood. True power wasn't control. It wasn't forcing others into a lower position. It was respect. And throughout her entire career, she had denied that respect to the very people she was meant to serve. Now she was the one left behind. Alone. Forgotten. And for the first time in her life, she truly understood what that felt like. As the sun dipped below the airport skyline, Miss Chandler sat in silence. Her eyes followed the darkening sky. Nothing remained but the weight of her own mistakes. And this time, no one was coming to save her. A cold evening breeze swept through, making her shiver. She sat there, unmoving, feeling every moment of failure, of loss. But in the midst of despair, a thought crept into her mind. She couldn't sit here forever. Her life wasn't over. She had lost everything familiar. But maybe, this was a chance to start again. Slowly she pulled out her phone. Not to call for help this time, but to search for a new path. A customer service course? A job somewhere far from aviation? She didn't know. But she knew she had to do something. Tomorrow would be difficult. But if she had learned anything today, it was a lesson in humility, a lesson in how to treat others. And maybe if she truly changed, one day she'd get a chance to start over. She stood up from the bench, took a deep breath. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. The first step. Miss Chandler slowly rose to her feet, her legs still unsteady after hours of sitting in thought. The sky had deepened to a shade of midnight blue, streetlights flickering, casting a faint golden glow onto the pavement. She looked around. No one was there. No familiar colleagues. No rushing passengers. Nothing but her. And the road ahead. She unlocked her phone, scrolling through her contacts once more. Not to beg. Not to plead. But to find a different name. A friend from outside the airline industry. Someone who once told her, "If you ever want to try something new, just call me." Her finger stopped on the name, James Carter. He had worked in luxury hospitality, where treating customers with respect mattered even more than in aviation. She had once mocked him for that, but now she understood. Taking a deep breath, she pressed call. The phone rang. What? Twice? 3 times. Chandler? James' voice came through, slightly surprised but not distant. She swallowed hard, feeling a small but undeniable sense of relief. James, are you still looking for a manager? Silence for a few seconds. Then, are you willing to start over? She closed her eyes, remembering Ethan Vance's unreadable gaze. The moment everything collapsed. Then she opened them again, her voice steadier than ever. Yes. On the other end, James chuckled softly. All right. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. I'll send you the address. The call ended. Miss Chandler stared at the screen. The words "call ended, 0:42 seconds, glowing back at her. A brief conversation. But enough to open a new path. She turned back for one last look at the airport, then faced forward, stepping away, leaving the past behind. Tomorrow she would start again. And this time, she wouldn't make the same mistakes.